This is the story of Darwin's finches and the evolutionary history of those birds. Our story begins over here on the mainland of South America, maybe a few million years ago. And a group of finches, a population of finches, ended up here on the Galapagos Islands, which is a set of islands, an archipelago of islands, some distance from the coast of South America. And once they were there, they were trapped there. So this was a founding species. So this is sometimes referred to as the founder effect, because it was a small population that had a very limited gene pool. The only traits that came with them were the ones that were here in the population, and then they were trapped on these islands to fill in all the different islands. And there's a lot of islands in the Galapagos, each with different habitats and niches to be filled. Because it was a small population, there was a limited gene pool, and therefore evolution happened rather quickly. The birds that landed on these islands were now marooned, and they were stranded there because they didn't have the ability to migrate all the way back. They were separated geographically from the mainland, from the original population there on the mainland. And so now they were on this new island, which was a very different habitat. Competition was fierce. And so Darwin's rule of natural selection took place, as it always does. You had organisms competing to survive, and as they competed to survive, they were isolated, and there was no gene flow bringing new genes in. So they just had this gene pool to work with. And working with just that gene pool, then we started to see some changes happen quickly from an evolutionary standpoint. So as the birds filled in the different niches, some lived and some didn't. Those that lived, they passed on their genes to the next generation. And so the genes that were advantageous increased in the gene frequency, and the genes that were not advantageous saw a decrease in gene frequency. This caused a change in the gene pool. Remember, the gene pool is the collection of all the alleles in a population. And as that gene pool changed, that is microevolution. Microevolutionary changes because they are small changes. It's changing one trait. So maybe over some time, the average beak size for a population is slowly increasing as they're forced to eat harder seeds. That's a microevolutionary change. Now, if you take microevolutionary change 1 and then microevolutionary change number 2, and you add them all together and they accumulate, then you get macroevolution. And when you get macroevolution is when you have reproductive isolation, when they can no longer mate anymore from others in that population without some of those changes. The populations have become so different genetically that they can no longer mate, and they are reproductively isolated. Now we say we have speciation. That has happened, and they have become different species. And in the case of Darwin's finches, we ended up with 13 different species from that original species on the island that came from the mainland, and then got separated on that island. We initially had what's called allopatric speciation because we had a geographic separation between the mainland of South America and the islands out here in the Pacific Ocean. And so if you have a geographic separation, then that's allopatric speciation. The species or the populations on these islands were geographically isolated from the ones on the mainland. The habitat was different. So the ones that survived were the ones that had the traits that allowed them to survive, the different beak sizes that allowed them to survive. And so these continued to evolve in one direction. So if we drew it as a tree, the ones on the mainland continued to evolve in their habitat, and then the ones on the island branched off. At that point right there, where they become separate from one another, that's our allopatric speciation, and they branched off. And the longer they are apart in these two habitats, the more different they got. And so that is an example of divergent evolution. Now, once they're on the islands, we see our branching that looks like this pattern here. And so we start to see more branching happen, and we end up with 13 different species. Those 13 different species are all filling different niches and habitats. But they're on these islands where they could fly from one to the other. And so they're not separated geographically. They are separated by different niches. Some are eating small seeds, some are eating large seeds, some are eating nectar from flowers, Some are eating insects. And as they are eating different things, they are being separated from each other just by behavior. They don't come in contact anymore, so that leads to reproductive isolation as well. We call it sympatric speciation. The result is the same, reproductive isolation and speciation. The end result, then you combine the forces of allopatric speciation and sympatric speciation, which is the result of microevolutionary changes accumulating to make a macroevolutionary change, which came from changes in the gene frequency from the original gene pool that came from the original population on the island. The end result is adaptive radiation of the finches from one species to 13 different species of finches. So these 13 different species of finches radiated to fill 13 niches due to adaptations that separated them to fill 13 different niches. That's why we call it adaptive radiation, because it was the different adaptations that they developed to allow them to fill the 13 niches to radiate out, meaning spread out to fill the different niches. And that's how we went from one finch species on the mainland to 13 on the islands.